All right, I think we'll get started on this next panel. Good morning. I'm Christian Ostermann. I direct the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program in Washington, D.C., and I'm a member of the ACONA Executive Board and delighted to moderate this panel on echoes of Reykjavik, from arms race to common ground, with a very distinguished group of panelists that I'll introduce in a moment. First of all, thanks to our Icelandic hosts for this wonderful conference, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We are starting this day of discussions about the future of arms control very appropriately with a retrospective on the heyday of nuclear arms control, especially the October 1986 Reykjavik summit between Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan. Our panelists, I hope, will take us back 4 decades to the years 1985, 1995, which saw impressive successes in nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, as well as major missed opportunities. That period, of course, the period from 1985 to 1995, was preceded by one of the darkest moments in the Cold War, the fall of 1983, in which some scholars have argued the two nuclear superpowers came the closest to a possible nuclear confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In the fall of that year, the Soviets experienced a war scare and might have considered the possibility of a US first strike under the guise of the Able Archer nuclear exercise. That remains controversial, but it is being debated. And by the end of that year, all arms control negotiations stopped as the Reagan administration started deploying intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe in response to similar Soviet deployments in the 1970s. This situation, of course, changed dramatically in 1985 when a young and energetic new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power. The Soviet Union announced his new vision for foreign policy called the New Thinking in long, substantive letters to President Reagan. He proposed to end the Cold War and bring about dramatic change in relations between the two countries. As the New Thinking evolved, and we'll hear about this a little bit more, it started to include more radical ideas such as the abolition of nuclear weapons, an idea that had become very central to President Reagan's own thinking. In January 1986, Gorbachev launched a public initiative to abolish nuclear weapons by the year 2000. The ensuing discussions in both capitals paved the road to the breakthroughs at the summit in Reykjavik and later those in Washington and Moscow. When Reagan and Gorbachev met here in the Icelandic capital, at the Hefti House where we were last night, the world came closest to the actual abolition of nuclear weapons than it has ever been before or after. At one point, Reagan suggested that the two sides could sign an agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons, all nuclear explosives within 10 years, to which Gorbachev replied, "We could say that and we could list all of those weapons in the treaty." The transcripts of these conversations, of course, now are available. The agreement, of course, fell apart over Reagan's unwillingness to give up his proposal for a strategic defense initiative and Gorbachev's lack in trust in Reagan's willingness to see through deep nuclear cuts. In his memoirs, Gorbachev described the Reykjavik summit as filled with Shakespearean passions. And so Reykjavik was also a missed opportunity, even if some of the ideas discussed came to fruition in the following years. It's not only appropriate to start our day here in Reykjavik with some reflections on that summit by distinguished panelists, but also because taking a look at history is important as we think about future policy options. Obviously, the context of 1986 is very different from today, still taking us back some 40 years to a time when things looked very bleak indeed may encourage us to approach the future with some greater sense of possibility. It speaks to my larger belief this is the historian coming out in me, that history can benefit decision makers as historical thinking and research challenges long-held fundamental assumptions and well-established myths, allows policymakers to imagine alternative scenarios and multiple outlooks, and sensitizes us all to complexity, contingency, and unintended consequences. And finally, allows for understanding of the deeper connections between policy issues over space and time. In this spirit, I've asked our panelists to reflect on the events back in the day, perhaps share some war stories. Some wonderful stories were shared last night as dinner. I hope you will get to hear some of them, but also draw some lessons learned. We have a very distinguished panel. I will introduce them in turn. Our first speaker is Guðmundur Hálfdánarson, professor of history at the University of Iceland. He served at the university in various administrative capacities. Previously was Dean of the School of Humanities, Chair of the Faculty of History and Philosophy. He received his PhD and MA from Cornell and his BA from the University of Iceland. Delighted to have him kick off this panel today.
Thank you, Christian. I feel a little bit like an imposter here because I'm not an expert on nuclear armament or discussions. My field of expertise is actually 19th and 20th century nationalism, but I was here in 1986 when the summit, whatever we call it, was held in Reykjavik. I was doing my PhD at Cornell University, but I was here doing my research at the time. The news of this summit came just as out of the blue. I mean, no one was expecting this. So at the end of September, or actually I think the last day of September, the first news of this were broadcasted in Iceland that there was going to be a summit in less than 2 weeks held in Reykjavik. There had been recent problems between the Soviet Union and the United States that were hastily solved before this summit. The leaders of these two major superpowers, they were locked in mortal, but mostly non-lethal combat and competition. There were two very dissimilar personalities, but in both ways, rather unconventional. And they had kind of a shared willingness to curb the nuclear buildup. We may be hearing more about it from more experts, how they saw this Cold War. And this was an unsustainable buildup of nuclear weapons, that was clear. And it was economically ruining the Soviet Union. And of course, it threatened the world existence as nuclear weapons do still. So it was Gorbachev who initiated the meeting, and it came on the heels of a summit in Geneva the year before. He suggested, or the Russians or Soviet suggested, two places, either London or Reykjavik, and Reagan and his advisors selected Reykjavik, probably because of its location. Iceland was a member and still is a member of NATO. And I think basically also, and this is also hinted, that they were quite sure holding the summit in Iceland, the local authorities would not be interfering into the discussion. I mean, holding it in London, I'm sure that Margaret Thatcher would have wanted to play some role, but Steingrímur Hermannsson, our Prime Minister, even if he wanted to play a role, he was not allowed to. Okay, so in many ways it was Gorbachev who had more writing on the outcome of this discussion, because the Soviet Union was in trouble. I remember this, and I'm going to talk about this from two angles. First of all, basically from my angle as an Icelander, being here in Reykjavik at the time. My childhood was shaped by the fear of nuclear threat. I mean, we who were raised during the Cold War, the nuclear threat was always there. That was something that we feared. And the feeling was at the time that the Iron Curtain was, in a sense, impermeable and would kind of divide the world into two for ages to come. We were wrong. I'm a historian, so I only have to predict for the past, so that's fine. We couldn't see the 89-90 coming. Okay, so at the end of September, the news comes that Iceland is going to hold this big summit in Reykjavik in less than 2 weeks. At the time, Reykjavik was a sleepy small town, as Frances Fitzgerald describes it in her book on Reagan and the Star Wars. It was a town of size of Sioux City in Iowa, so it was not a great city, not a big city. It was going to be the scene for the greatest show on earth, and that was going to happen in less than 2 weeks. The Icelandic government had never taken a task of this magnitude before, and Metz was riding on the success of this task. We had Nixon-Pompidou summit in 1973, and we had Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky in 72, but nothing like this had happened before, and we had a little bit more time to prepare. We have to remember that at that time, Iceland was not the tourist attraction as it is now. I mean, in the year 1985, we had less than 100,000 tourists coming to Iceland. We have 2.5 million now, so the whole infrastructure was much less developed than it is now. You needed accommodations for the number of journalists, diplomats, and people coming to the country, restaurant, transportation. So it was a huge task. This was not really supposed to be a summit. It was a pre-summit summit. So in many ways, the whole organization and preparation was limited. So Reykjavik became the center of attention in the world for a few days. This was seen as very important for a small nation that is hungry for being noticed. I mean, Icelanders tend to be very proud when someone notices them, and they're ever self-conscious of their reputation abroad. So it was clear that this impossible task was something that we wanted to do well. And we used the common saying in Iceland, "Þetta reddast." This is all going to be okay. But there were a few hiccups. There were no hotels for the people to stay in. They had to kick out the people that were already in the hotels to find space for the guests that were coming. Foreign visitors who came to Iceland had to demonstrate that they had a place to stay, which caused political tension around Jewish activists who wanted to come to Iceland to protest against what was happening with the Soviet Union at the time. But it all reddadist, it all worked out okay. There were no major problems. The actual location of the talks, Höfði, was only selected, I think, less than a week before the actual meeting happened. It was going to be in Hotel Saga, a hotel which is now is being turned into a university building close to here. There were no security breaches, but everything happened, and this is something that everyone in Iceland who lived through this remembers. Everything happened behind a closed door. Nothing happened really. I mean, the doors at Höfði were closed. There was a press blackout during the talks, and they were mostly held. So no one really knew what was happening. The town was full of journalists who had nothing to do because they had nothing to report. The Icelandic government had organized a program for them, showing them the world's strongest man, who happened to be in Iceland, and the world's most beautiful woman. For some reason, the political reporters were not very interested. I have no idea why. I remember my professor in America wrote to me, "Do you really think that we believe that you believe in elves?" That was something that really was being broadcast around the world. But what happened behind these closed doors? To an outside observer, this summit seemed to be a total failure. It ended in no clear agreement. And in the Economic and Political Weekly in October 1986, it was called an anticlimax, obviously of a disastrous kind. It was the Reykjavik fiasco. So that is not something that we want to remember. Because Gorbachev surprised everyone by the proposal for comprehensive nuclear disarmament, this raised expectations, but which were probably not realistic that this would be solved in Reykjavik. There were intensive negotiations, and as we know, and we will hear more about later, the world, they did not come to an agreement, in part because of the SDI, and probably because it was never going to happen in this manner. It takes more to end the nuclear buildup than two guys sitting in Höfði and decide to do it. In the eyes of the Icelandic public, Gorbachev came out the victor. He brought his wife with him. Raisa came, but Nancy stayed home. And he held an open press conference here in Háskólabíó, the University Cinema, which is right next door, while Reagan went to the American Army base and held a rally with American soldiers. That was, many Icelanders felt that was kind of an insult. But what is the legacy of the Reykjavik meeting? What do we remember? There is no Reykjavik Accord like Helsinki Accords. There's nothing here that we can say reminds us of Reykjavik. It kind of is, what reminds us are the kind of missed opportunities that many people see. Strobe Talbot called it one of the strangest episodes in the annals of nuclear diplomacy, and in many ways it was. But maybe it opened the door to what happened in the year afterwards. In treaties like the INF Treaty in the following year, the START Treaty in 1991, we don't know what would have happened if Gorbachev would not kind of laid out this plan and Reagan not been president of the United States. I was discussing this with my colleague before. It is very strange when you begin to miss the Cold War. It is probably not a healthy situation. But in many ways, we are in a worse situation now than we were at the time. The kind of security structure that was built, as Christian mentioned, in these decades is kind of crumbling. The two superpowers are now many powers who have nuclear weapons, and there is no kind of structure to deal with these issues. So we need new negotiating partners. We need a new generation of people to negotiate nuclear disarmament, because nuclear weapons are just as dangerous now as they were before, and especially when world leaders begin to threaten to use tactical nuclear weapons. I think there's a time to start a new Reykjavik summit to try to end this madness as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hálfdánarson. We now turn to Dr. Edward Ifft, who has been involved in negotiating and implementing many of the key nuclear arms control agreements over the past 45 years. He has a PhD in physics from Ohio State University. His career was primarily at the State Department. Early on, he served in U.S. delegations to negotiations on SALT and TTBT in Helsinki, Vienna, and Moscow. Then became senior State Department representative to both START 1 and CTBT negotiations in Geneva. After START concluded, he was deputy director of the on-site inspection agency, then senior advisor to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And as a US START inspector, he participated in inspections in many sensitive military installations in the former Soviet Union. He served as the last US commissioner for the ABM Treaty until the US withdrew. And he participated in CTBT integrated field exercises in Kazakhstan in 2008 and Jordan 2014. He's currently a distinguished fellow, visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and it gives me great pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. You've just had a very good scene setter for the momentous events at Reykjavik. As you know, there were 4 Reagan-Gorbachev summits. First one was the so-called Fireside Summit in Geneva in 1985, then the summit here, then one in Washington and one in Moscow. So the Reykjavik summit was the most famous and the most dramatic of them all. And 1986 was the year when Americans learned how to spell Reykjavik. And that was something of a breakthrough, I do think. So I was not here. Pavel was here and was an active participant, so he's the supreme authority on what happened here. But I'm happy to share my thoughts on how I understood what happened and why. I was watching it from Geneva, where I was working on the START Treaty. So we were watching events here very closely and hoping that the two presidents would solve some of the hard issues which were plaguing us in Geneva, which they did. Just as a bit of background, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz both thought that it was very important to improve relations with the Soviet Union, and they went to some lengths to do that. The Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin at the time was allowed to drive into the basement of the US State Department and take a private elevator up to the 7th floor so that he could come in and meet privately with Shultz and before Shultz Kissinger without people noticing. So, I mean, that was an indication of the kind of trust and serious attempts that were being made. And so, you know, that kind of was the background for the start in these negotiations. There were low expectations for the meeting here. The White House was at pains to say this was not a summit, it was just a meeting. I mean, that was a little silly. Of course it was a summit. Everybody knew it was a summit. But once it was over, everybody called it a summit. But the White House wanted to downplay expectations. One reason for that was that the Soviets had told us there were not going to be any dramatic new proposals coming from their side, which of course turned out not to be the case. So the briefing book that was assembled for President Reagan had a lot of mistakes in it, in particular the parts of what to expect Gorbachev to say and who were going to be the good guys and the not so good guys on the Soviet delegation, which turned out to be wrong. In particular, Marshal Akrameyev showed up, I think, for the first time on the Soviet side, and he won high praise from the Americans, particularly from Paul Nitze, as a very reasonable and intelligent man, and he was a welcome addition on the Soviet side. So let me read you what George Shultz said about arriving here. Shultz says, "I stayed at the Holt Hotel, which fronts on a narrow street not far from the water. The rooms were small and taut, as if to get the cold, dark outer world as little space to penetrate as possible. I had been to Iceland before. I found it a comforting yet exhilarating place. The air was cold and fresh and stimulating. Yet, at this time of year, it was also foreboding with its endless hours of darkness." That's not exactly a 4-star recommendation, but I mean, personally, I think a little foreboding is okay, maybe even useful. So the U.S. for the first time tried to expand the summit agenda, in particular, not to just focus on arms control, but also to discuss human rights. And we were pleasantly surprised that Gorbachev was willing to do that. Gorbachev immediately made some big concessions, which I won't go into in detail, but the U.S. side was pleasantly surprised. One thing that Gorbachev did was he agreed for the first time to stop insisting that British and French forces should be added to the American totals. Gorbachev had gone to Paris, he talked to Mitterrand, he went to London, he talked to Thatcher. In both capitals, he was told in no uncertain terms, our nuclear forces are independent. In no way are we ever going to allow those to be added to the American forces in some treaty. And so Gorbachev accepted that, and he dropped that demand here, and that was good because it had been plaguing us for a long time, ever since the SALT negotiations in Helsinki and Vienna. Now, the Russians are beginning to raise British and French forces again, but that's another question for another day. Also, Gorbachev here made clear for the first time that he really was serious about strong verification, and he was willing to accept intrusive on-site inspection. We'd had hints of that, but I think people weren't sure until he made it quite clear here. There was already on the table a proposal by Gorbachev to eliminate all nuclear weapons in 3 stages by the year 2000. That proposal, I think, was not considered a serious one by either delegation in Geneva, and we never even talked about it, but it was there. As things unfolded, as Gorbachev was talking about deep reductions, Reagan, well, there are several accounts of exactly how this happened. The one I believe is that Reagan was handed a note by a senior DoD official and a National Security Council staffer, which said, "Why don't you propose to eliminate all offensive ballistic missiles?" Which he did to counter what Gorbachev was saying. Let's eliminate all offensive strategic ballistic missiles. That, of course, was a very one-sided proposal. Why? Because the Soviets had an advantage, a perceived advantage in ballistic missiles, whereas the US had a huge advantage in bombers. I mean, at the time, the US was spending about 40% of its strategic budget on the bomber force. And so Gorbachev could have said, you can't be serious. You're saying that we should give up our ballistic missiles, but you get to keep your bomber force? No way. He didn't say that. Instead, he focused on the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which was Reagan's fantastical idea of building an ABM system in space in which lasers would be powered by small nuclear explosions and shoot down all Soviet ballistic missiles, on the way to the US. So when Reagan made this proposal, Gorbachev then said, why don't we just eliminate all nuclear weapons? And Reagan apparently said yes. I mean, the transcripts sort of indicate that he said, yes, let's do that. George Shultz insists that Reagan all along had thought that nuclear weapons were immoral and he wanted to get rid of them. And Nancy Reagan, in fact, was an influence on Ronald in that she also believed that nuclear weapons were evil and we should get rid of them. And so it was natural that he would say this. But then, as you all know, the whole thing foundered on the SDI thing. Let me just read you something else. I mean, this is by way of telling all of you inspiring negotiators the extreme importance of paying close attention to language, to specific words, especially when you're talking, but even more so in anything that gets written down. So at 3 a.m, in the working group in one of the other rooms in Hofty House, the following was produced. Both sides agreed to confine itself, already terrible English, both sides agree to confine themselves, please, to research, development, and testing, which is permitted by the ABM Treaty for a period of blank years. The US proposed 5, but that was obviously a negotiated number. Through 1991, 5 years, during which time a 50% reduction of strategic nuclear arsenals would be achieved. Does anybody see a problem with that language? This paragraph got massaged, and the Soviets produced counter versions of it and so on. But what I want to call your attention to was research, development, and testing, which is permitted by the ABM Treaty. What does that mean? Does that mean that all research, development, and testing is permitted by the ABM Treaty? Or does it mean the research, development, and testing, which is in the ABM Treaty, can be continued? Not clear. I mean, it would have been fixed with one word if they had said, confine itself to that research, development, and testing, which is permitted by the ABM Treaty. But they didn't do that. And so this opened up a huge argument which went on in Washington and between the Americans and the Soviets, not especially here, but in Geneva. And this gets into the broad versus the narrow interpretation of the ABM Treaty. Let's not go there. But you see my point, how the absence of a single word caused enormous difficulties because, well, this was agreed at the summit, you know, so there we are. All right, so when Reagan agreed to get rid of all nuclear weapons, I guess if I had been in the room, which is a fantastical thought, but if I had been in the room, I would have sent Reagan a note along the following lines. Sir, I think you just agreed to a world in which all nuclear weapons are controlled by the British, the French, and the Chinese. I'm pretty sure that is not okay. Or maybe, sir, you've agreed to convince the British and the French to get rid of their nuclear weapons, in which case, who here in Hofty House is speaking for the Chinese? Gorbachev? Doesn't seem like that's the case. Anyway, so as you know, I mean, you saw that very sad picture of the two of them coming out of Hofty House looking extremely disappointed, which they were. I think Gorbachev went home more disappointed than Reagan, but who knows? But they did, in fact, make a lot of progress on INF issues and START issues. When Reagan got back to Washington, the reaction there was not good. Within a couple of days, the JCS sent a top-secret memo to Reagan, which I have seen. Basically, it says in a very polite way, going to zero is a terrible idea and we cannot support that. The Allies were upset. Congress was upset because they had not been consulted. The best story is Margaret Thatcher coming to Washington. She met with Reagan and politely objected. But when she visited Schultz has said this several times in my presence, that he was beaten about the head and shoulders with Margaret Thatcher's handbag. Why? How dare you make an agreement like that without consulting with us? And so, you know, this was a problem. So the White House quickly sort of backed away from this whole idea of zero, sort of saying, well, yeah, Gorbachev made this proposal, but nothing came of it. You know, so, you know, nothing, there's nothing to see here. Or, well, yes, Reagan agreed, but all he was doing was confirming Article 6 of the NPT, which says we're all going to go to zero someday. Okay, so, I mean, INF quickly fell into place. The double zero was not agreed here. What was agreed here was more like the famous walk in the woods, 100 warheads, not in Europe, but in Asia. And the US 100 presumably would be in the United States, ready to deploy somewhere. START, the numbers were agreed here in Reykjavik. It took us 4 years, however. I mean, the INF people finished their treaty like the next year. It took us on START 4 years. How is that possible? Well, see me later. I'll tell you why it took 4 years. But definitions, verification regime, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so sort of that's what happened in my view. Now, what lessons have we learned in the 50 years that we've been doing this. I would say we are good at the use of national technical means for verification. It doesn't always give the right answer, but it's quite good, a lot better than it used to be. It would be a lot better if it also had on-site inspection. We are very good at a wide variety of inspection techniques and procedures. We are very good at counting deployed launchers, missiles, bombers, and warheads in declared locations. We know how to conduct notifications and data exchanges. We are good at elimination procedures of all kinds of things, including chemical weapons, except warheads. Perimeter and portal continuous monitoring. We know how to monitor a facility, what goes in and out. We can do that. We'll probably want to do that in the future. We know how to operate an open skies regime. Some of those may sound trivial to you. They are not trivial. They're all the product of hard negotiations and a lot of experience in the field. However, we have little experience with counting non-deployed warheads. Okay, we don't know how to do that. The elimination of warheads. Of course, we and the Russians eliminate warheads safely all the time, but there have never been any agreed procedures for doing that or for verifying those procedures if they could be agreed. We don't know how to verify the production and disposal of fissile material. We're not very good at challenge inspections, although we have some experience in Iraq and so on. And we're not very good at dealing effectively with compliance issues. So I guess my closing thought would be, can we use what we've learned in the last 50 years, which is a lot, to move forward with some significant arms control? It's difficult for me to be very optimistic about that, but I'm hoping that the rest of the day will produce some hope on that front. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ed. We'll go next to somebody who was really close to the negotiations at the summit, Pavel Palazhchenko, who's head of international relations and to the PR department at the Gorbachev Foundation. He teaches at Moscow Linguistic University and works as a freelance interpreter. From 1980 to 1991, he served in the Foreign Ministry and the Executive Office of the USSR President. In that capacity, as interpreter and advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev and Edward Shevardnadze, participated in all US-Soviet summits and ministerial meetings held during that period, 1985 to 1991. We're delighted to have him also as a member of the ACONA International Advisory Board. And Pavel, over to you.
Thank you very much. I probably will not be as specific on some of the details of the negotiations, even though I was present there. I would like to talk a little bit about how dramatic the whole thing was in Reykjavik, but also before and after Reykjavik. I was on vacation in the summer of 1986 in my hometown, and I received a call from Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Besmetnych asking me to come to Moscow quickly. He said, we're sending a car for you because there is a letter that we need urgently to have translated into English. That was all he said. I was in Moscow within 19 minutes, and he showed me a draft letter from Gorbachev to Reagan. Gorbachev had also been on vacation in a much nicer place, and he received a letter from Reagan and a draft reply to Reagan's letter that he was supposed to sign. The draft was worked out by the foreign ministry. At that time, Shevardnadze too was on vacation, everyone was on vacation. But that letter and that draft reply Gorbachev didn't like. He said that we are getting back into the rut, into the routine of negotiations without solutions. That was disappointing to him, very frustrating to him. because he felt that after Geneva and that famous statement by Reagan and Gorbachev that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, negotiations should go a lot faster, and agreements should be concluded, must be concluded, that would actually implement that statement by big cuts, by deep cuts of nuclear weapons. So he wrote to Reagan that, Mr. President, negotiations, despite our overall agreement about inadmissibility of nuclear war that we signed in Geneva negotiations, are going nowhere. We need a quick meeting somewhere halfway between Moscow and Washington, maybe in London or Reykjavik, in order to sort things out and give a boost to the negotiations. So I translated that letter, and that was probably one of the very, very few occasions when, despite my being interpreter to the Soviet leaders, I really knew something that just about no one knew at that time. You don't get to know really too many real secrets when you work as interpreter at summits, frankly. But again, right after that letter was delivered, Marshal Akameyev was in Washington, and he was told by the US side that Reagan generally agrees that he would prefer Reykjavik because it's a smaller place. There wouldn't be that onslaught of media people and all kinds of people, and therefore he would prefer Reykjavik. Preparations did not really start because there was one of those regular things that happen in relations between big powers, and that's a spy scandal. A Soviet UN official was arrested in New York, and an American reporter was then arrested in Moscow. And when Shevardnadze was going to Washington to meet with President Reagan, he was in a very dark mood, really depressed, because he believed that probably that would derail the summit. And I saw that he really was depressed. At the meeting with Reagan basically said, and Schultz had said that before to Shevardnadze, that unless that matter is resolved and the American reporter is freed by the Soviet government, is released by the Soviet government, there will be no summit. So then we return to the Soviet embassy. We'll go to the protected room, and there is the ambassador, Shevardnadze's deputy Besmertnych, and some other people there. And there is a heavy silence for, I think, like 3 or 4 minutes. And no one dares speak because, as I said, Shevardnadze is in a dark mood. And finally, the ambassador, the then Soviet ambassador to Washington, Yuri Dubinin, asks Shevardnadze, Eduard Ambrosievich, what's the situation? And Shevardnadze, after a pause, says, the situation is not good. And then suddenly he looks at me and asks, what do you think? And I surprised myself. You know, this is the first time that in such a setting Shevardnadze asked me anything. And I surprised myself by saying, I don't think it's that bad, because I think we have, on the one hand, a confirmation that Reagan wants to meet Gorbachev. On the other hand, of course, the context is not good, but that needs to be resolved. I said something like this, and I cannot quote myself word for word. And work started on resolving that spy scandal. And it took altogether, I think, like 20 hours of negotiations. And that was during the UN General Assembly. So Schultz was there, Rose Ridgway was there on the US side, and Besmertnych on the Russian side. They discussed the details. Shevardnadze and Schultz discussed the overall situation. And ultimately, a solution was found that allowed everyone to save face. So then, in mid-September, I think on the 20th of September, we understood that there will be a summit in Reykjavik. Of course, Reykjavik was not a city for big negotiations. There were plenty of people. The Soviet government brought a passenger liner, Georg Otz, to the harbor here, and that was the residence of Gorbachev and most of the Soviet delegation. I initially was supposed to stay at a hotel, but they said, Gorbachev wants you to be there on the ship. So finally, when negotiations started at Hoover House, the details are well known because the records of those negotiations have been published. I will not recount what happened, but what really struck me was that during those negotiations, even though the discussion, as Ed told you, on the possibility of a world without nuclear weapons was a little chaotic and looked like it was a collection of misunderstandings, etc. I felt that they were really on the same page in terms of their rejection of nuclear weapons, philosophical revulsion of nuclear weapons. This is something that was confirmed many times afterwards, both during their presidencies and afterwards. I interpreted their meeting in 1992 at Reagan's ranch near Los Angeles, Simi Valley. No, not Simi Valley. Simi Valley was afterwards. But anyway, I interpreted their conversation in their post-presidential years. And for Reagan and for Gorbachev, this was really their conviction. And they were on the same page. Most of the experts, most of the military, most of the diplomats really believed that, the NPT obligation to get rid of all nuclear weapons was basically paying lip service to the ultimate goal, and that could only happen not in any foreseeable future. Reagan and Gorbachev really believed that the world would be better off without nuclear weapons. And I think, Gorbachev certainly believed that until the end of his life. He said the ultimate goal must be the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, when the conversation ended, the reason for it ending was not that Gorbachev insisted that the US end the SDI program. That was never his demand. But what Reagan wanted was that Gorbachev give a green light to an unlimited prosecution of the SDI initiative. The US really believed, or purported to believe, that all testing, including testing in space, is permitted by the ABM Treaty. By the way, without the comma that the US insisted on, which is permitted, testing, comma, which is permitted by the ABM Treaty. Without the comma, it would have been totally acceptable. Because only that which is permitted by the ABM Treaty if you don't have that comma. But anyway, that's linguistic. I could talk about linguistic aspects for a long time, but I will not do that. So, but in terms of policy, yes, Reagan wanted Gorbachev to give a green light to any testing of space weapons, and that Gorbachev could not do. One of those things that he was not a czar who could agree to anything, and that's implemented. He was, at that time, not even president. He was general secretary of the Communist Party, limited in his decisions by the agencies, by the Politburo, etc. He could not, under any circumstances, agree to giving a total green light to SDI. When it ended, I mean, you saw those pictures yesterday at Hoover House. I was with them when they left the building, and there was that final conversation where Gorbachev said, you demanded one thing to which I cannot agree, and I'm sorry that it is. Reagan said, I'm sorry it happened, that we cannot sign anything, even a broad declaration. Gorbachev said, I went as far as I could, but there's one thing I could not agree, etc. So they said goodbye, both of them, if not heartbroken, but certainly upset. But then Gorbachev walks to the place where they had the press conference. Reagan goes to the airport. Schultz gives a brief, it's not press conference, but a brief talk to the media, and he said, we are sorry that Reykjavik turned out to be a failure. This was reported to Gorbachev while we were walking to the press conference. And he then recalled many times that that gave him thought about what to say to the press. And when finally the press conference started, he said, Reykjavik was not a failure. It was a breakthrough because we looked over the horizon and we also agreed on many of the specifics of the future treaties. He also then said, now I suggest that the president should think about what happened. The US Congress should think about what happened. We should think about what happened and then get back to work. I think that was really, I interpreted that press conference and I thought that that was really a smart way of actually drawing a final line under Reykjavik, but at the same time opening up windows for future discussions. Those discussions produced the INF Treaty, which was difficult, but it took a little more than a year. And then the START Treaty, which is a good treaty and became a model for the New START Treaty signed by Obama and Medvedev. It has now been suspended. I think this is something that we need to find a way of getting out of this situation, because suspension is something that is not in the treaty. You cannot suspend a treaty. Basically, it means that there are no on-site inspections. Otherwise, we have been exchanging information about and information about the status of forces and also notifications of ballistic missile launches, which is very important. And that's under another agreement that I think was also a child of Reykjavik. And that is the agreement on prior notification of ballistic missile launches that was signed, if I'm not mistaken, in 87 or 88. So we still have the backbone for a return to some kind of negotiations on arms control. I believe that there were certain missteps even after the start of the conflict in Ukraine that could have been avoided. So there's got to be a way to return to strategic stability consultations and ultimately to negotiations, because it's my conviction that the world and Russia and the US really must not abandon that negotiating track and arms control track. And this is something where you will probably be involved in the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Pavel. Our final speaker is Dr. Shubo, Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the Institute of International Relations at the China Foreign Affairs University, holds a PhD from Beida, focuses on international political economy, global governance, and qualitative research methods, published a number of books. I won't list them here. He was a member of the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum and also a research fellow at the China and the World Center in Beijing. With that, floor over to you. We're quickly running out of time, so...
Yeah, thank you very much. I will keep brief. Yes, and I will focus on the lessons we learned from the arms control and the nuclear disarmament negotiation by now. And I will make like 4 points. The first, definitely we know history and history experience are important, especially for decision makers and especially for China and Chinese leaders. And historical analogy is one of the very useful technique for quick thinking and quick decision making. However, maybe the same history may have different meanings for different countries and for different people. For example, if you look at the World War I, and definitely the Americans and the Europeans learned the different lessons from World War I, right? The European Union, they maybe believe that is the war that will end all wars, right? But for Americans, they may think that is war fought for the Europeans. So we have to be very cautious when we're talking about history or historical license in general. Maybe that have different meanings for different peoples, right? And the second point I would like to say, China really learned the lessons, especially from the interaction between Soviet Union and the United States, especially during the Cold War. The former top diplomat, state counselor, Dai Bingguo, who was the state counselor and in charge of Chinese foreign policy the first decade of this century. After he stepped down, he wrote a memoir called The Strategic Dialogue. And in his book, he really highlights one point that China is different from Soviet Union, and especially regarding in foreign policy. And I think he really highlights two differences from China from the Soviet Union. The first, China now pursue directly confrontation or a fierce armed race with the United States. For Chinese leaders, they may think that is one region contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the second is the international expansion, especially the war in Afghanistan. So if you look at the Chinese foreign policy, it's since the 1990s, we can say that is kind of risk-aversion foreign policy, avoided directly military, in many aspects, the direct confrontation with the United States. So we do learn lessons from past and from the interaction between United States and the Soviet Union. And the third point I want to make. So when we're talking about learn lessons, but you have to understand that, especially if you put in to negotiation and you're really serious about their policy or their the policy language or rhetoric and the underlying logic of their policy language. And I think for Chinese and for Chinese leaders have a different nuclear posture from the United States and Soviet Union. So the first of all, for China, especially on the nature of nuclear weapons, the deterrence, and even the term of strategic stability. So when we look at the nuclear weapons, I think for Chinese, the nuclear weapons are so-called the paper tigers. And when China made nuclear weapons in the first place in 1960s, and I think the Chinese leaders really take the position, not actual use of these nuclear weapons. So the possibility of actual use of nuclear weapons for China is very, very low. And I think this is different from the Soviet Union and the United States, right? They really prepare for a nuclear war fighting. And they can launch the nuclear weapons in minutes, right? And the second, I think in China, the nuclear force or the nuclear arsenal is in a relatively low level. So it's so-called to be lean and effective. And it's trying to build a minimum, as a minimum means of retaliation, right? If China attacked by nuclear weapons, and then we can retaliate for that, right? So this is the second about nuclear force. The last one is about strategic stability, and I think in general, in the context talking about the Soviet Union and the United States, the strategic stability mainly refers to the nuclear weapons, strategic weapons stability. But I think from China's point of view, we more highlight the political side, right? The political point of view, right? It's not in terms of the equality of nuclear weapons, but especially the outcome is stability, right? So my last point is talking about when we apply the lessons we learn from Cold War or from the interaction between Soviet Union and the United States, we should be very cautious about the different context. So I just mentioned China has a different perception of the unique nuclear posture, right? So it's different. When we look at the nuclear disarmament, because just like Christian, you just mentioned at the opening, the panel, because that is really a dangerous situation, right? But China now, the nuclear, the military competition between China and the United States is different from the previous interaction during the Cold War. So when we apply the lessons learned from the Cold War to understand the current stand of U.S. relations, and we should be cautious. For example, I think especially talking about the relationship between transparency and mutual trust, right? And I think if you look at, I know the American observers blamed the China nuclear, especially is untransparent, right, about Chinese nuclear weapons. But I think that is untransparent is part of from the Chinese nuclear strategy logic, right? So maybe for Americans say trust but verify, but maybe for Chinese, but at least now we say if you trust, why you need to verify, right? So it's kindly. So I think from both sides. For China, I think in the near future we will learn and will increase the transparency. But on the other hand, and we have to look at there are multiple ways to build mutual trust, and also the challenges in building mutual trust beyond the nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Past our time, we were probably a little ambitious in limiting this session to 1 hour. I want to give an opportunity just for 1 or 2 questions before we adjourn, but please be aware you're between us and lunch. So, anyone, questions? Yes?
Thank you. Guy Roberts. I have a question for our Chinese colleague. Well, actually a 2-part question. Number one is, China is the only country, and you mentioned it, that is not transparent about its nuclear ambitions. And I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more of what and why they would not be more forthcoming when they have in some respects, a legal obligation to do so. And secondly, there is also an obligation under the NPT to enter into good faith negotiations for the reduction of arms, and China has refused to do so. Just signing on to negative and positive security assurance is not enough under the treaty. The other nations, nuclear power nations, have engaged in those discussions, and China has consistently refused to do so. I wonder if you might comment on that and whether or not they will in the future fulfill those obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, especially by the fellows?
Hi, my name is Christopher, support in Iceland. I will say thank you very much for the interesting story. And what is the sense? Because the President Reagan and Gorbachev, they come to Iceland for the reason in the nuclear, the military, arsenal. Like we are looking for the long story. December 1994, the Ukraine and Russia also they come to Budapest for the writing the memorandum. And for me, this is the very big the facts and the show, because the Russia never accept this memorandum.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll leave it at that. Quick response from Bo, and I don't know, probably if you wanted to respond, or anyone else wants to respond to the
That's
second
an
question.
interesting question. Maybe
Yeah, first question is about transparency. I think when you look at the transparency between United States and Soviet Union, and I think that based on the crazy arms race, right? Because and later that is why the Open Sky and other treaties signed. But China now part of that arms race. So I think partly, according to history, they not release the full information that is part of the Chinese deterrence strategy or deterrence capacity, right? So this is the first. And the second, I'm not very sure, but I think China signed the NPT, and China is part of the fulfill the commitment of the NPT, and and I think we are also ready for negotiation on arms control and disarmament and others. Oh, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel? With that, I think we'll bring this to a conclusion. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you for your questions and patience. And we're adjourned. Lunch until 1:15 when we'll resume for the Innovation Roundtable. Thank you.